All right. So the culture of Tri-Cities dark web. So in some ways, well, I mean, I know. Okay, so this is about the project, which is a justification that they use around here for essentially covering up and not arresting people. Okay? So the project, essentially, around here, this idea of blackmailing into a society in the 19 this idea has existed around here. See, Richland used to be a military installation. Okay, during the Manhattan Project, nobody was allowed to go to Richland, and that all the people that lived in Richland, which includes my grandparents and my parents, they lived in Richland. I mean, I guess my mom, they lived in Kennewick or something. But the people that were in Richland were people that worked out at Hanford. And that then it was a military base, essentially. And that my grandfather was basically a worker engineer out there during that time. And then my other grandfather was also basically a worker engineer. And then my grandmother was like basically one of the heads of essentially what would be the nursing department during World War II. She was like like a like a women's civil corps or whatever, and that she was a master's degree in nursing, and she was kind of the head of what would be like the health of children on that base out there. Was a part of that group. Okay, so it was a top secret base, and so there's already a culture that's existed here as the culture of secrecy. The signs of the clearance pictures that remind people not to talk about stuff. That kind of idea exists in a baseline way with the people that are from this area that stem from essentially the people that were like farmers, and then essentially the workers out of Hanford. The people that were farmers, this idea of citizen CIA, they used to all be brought inside. They would own gas stations, they would own farms, they would own businesses, but then they would always have their eye out for anything abnormal, and then they would relay potential information to essentially the top secret clearance staff in the military base of Richland and Manhattan Project. So that's kind of like where there's already like a baseline of being able to convince like older people that have lived around here since World War II. Okay. So then you have like the baby boomers that essentially they were given essentially like freedoms. See, it's like my father's generation and my mother's generation. They essentially, the children of the people that were working out there, essentially would like, if they ended up, normal people do dumb high school, dumb guys in their 20s and shit. They do something dumb and illegal or something. And then essentially the older people would give them passes on their behavior, and they'd be expected to to clean up their life, like a moral majority Reagan kind of idea afterward. Right. And so then, in the onslaught of the 70s, in the Church Commission, essentially this place was one of many MK Ultra sites. So from that, essentially anything that was involved with that type of stuff falls into what's called the project. And that can include a whole slew of abuses and justifications, and essentially there's like a whole kind of Republican world that anything that falls into stuff that it's basically like they have like a list of stuff that comes from Manhattan Project clearance, top secret clearance stuff, and the MK Ultra projects type of stuff. So then in the 1980s, I and other people around here my age were essentially put through somewhat of a similar type of MK Ultra project. And that in the 80s, that kind of stuff was not that what happened in the 60s and 70s and 50s, that kind of stuff, they didn't really have the free flow of information. They were able to isolate that kind of stuff to the region. People that knew about everything all grouped together and agreed to never speak about that shit. Okay? So then in the 1980s, essentially a similar kind of atrocity idea happened again. Rockwell themselves represents a company that comes from essentially an older Manhattan Project world, and that a lot of those MK Ultra ideas ran through subcontractors. And that basically, like, the things that happened to me were placed in some sort of agreed upon Reagan box of silence and passes. And then there's people in this town that essentially since the 90s, they would represent your run-of-the-mill kind of typical older kind of regular kind of Reagan kind of 1980s regular Republican kind of person. I mean, yeah, it's like they'd be like Mitt Romney or kind of those type of people. So then, essentially what they do around here is they have a secret list of all of those people that are my age. And that as the computer revolution started to happen in the 90s, then they started to build somewhat of a monitoring of all of those victims to see if they had memories of those events, because essentially rich and powerful people came here to Tri-Cities. There's also other cities where they did essentially the same idea. They came here and they blackmailed in a pedo band. That type of stuff by then was videoed in VHS and shit, and Polaroids and stuff. And see, that type of stuff was part of like essentially a theoretical like insider silencing where essentially if you didn't blackmail you wouldn't be brought into the insider world of what would be government contracting and stuff like that. And so since the night, I mean, in the 90s, that's when people hear that were like knowledgeable about that stuff. They kind of built like what would be a dark web nowadays. That's what you would call it nowadays, where they discuss victims and where they think that victims should have to do what their analysis or what their advice on what to do is. So, as the hacking world and as the dark web world started to become more dumb and tech nerdish, these people who have still sat in somewhat of a 90s time warp about this shit. And you'll get these cops and these Republicans and these rich people and subcontractors and shit that'll be like, we're talking about the projects. And then they'll justify going after victims to be silencing them. And that includes where when I started to notice, because this is what they just don't seem to want to accept. I'm the wizard. And that when they started targeting people that were on a list, and when they would sit there and watch people get blackmailed off of that list into silence. And so by the time I finally found that out in a confirmed way, that is where I started to monitor them, because they were tasked on keeping those victims from ever being blackmailed into their pedo bang fucking society. And so nowadays, their solutions sometimes involve like justifying doing the rape switch amnesia method, just like in the past. They used to do that shit in the past. People would start talking about that stuff, and then somebody would come into their house and would rape switch them into amnesia to be covering up and to be making them not remember. See, I knew about this stuff so much that my whole life I would place the illusion of not remembering anything on purpose. And that all along the while, and so nowadays, I have a dark web profile that whenever they fucking talk about me in this fucking town, then it starts to pull all the meta and data that they're doing. And then, when they justify, like, me, like, all this stuff would be the exact kind of shit that they would justify, like, using one of these S&M groups to be rape switching me into amnesia. I ain't afraid of those people. See, I'm the wizard. They have rules that they have to follow for that shit. So I just want to remind them that all that stuff is kind of a modern tech S&M now. And when you make a mistake, then you have to be made to forget about Satan. I mean, this is the real reality that these people in this town, They seem to think that it's completely okay to sit around as huge groups torturing some little girl who's talking about all of their, like, blackmail moments. Right? See, they view this stuff as typical, as like an acceptable idea. And that then they sit in their little brainwashed world, and then when they get outed as doing that, then all of a sudden they magically start thinking backwards. And then they expect some fucking Department of Defense or Department of Energy to be giving them some pass for blackmailing into a dark web society that feeds a group fund off of ripping off S&Ms nowadays. And that then it pays for certain things in their life and shit. And see, that's what they're really protecting. And so the other thing is that when I started to notice that they were busy sitting there causing the exploitation on all of their victims, then I started to wonder, I noticed that you're all getting money for that exploitation. And so that's what sick fuck is. And sick fuck has a master. And that when sick fuck does that shit, then you all have a punishment. A societal punishment. Where you all get to be put through what I went through as a little fucking boy. So that you people fucking learn not to ever exploit your fucking victims. This shit is just, it's like a automated fucking procedure out of their fucking mouths now. Where they've just sat around fine-tuning, feeling all smart and shit. They're the most stupidest fucking people. They got like the world's most psychotic little pedophiles that are sitting there working with these weird Republicans on pulling in money and keeping silence over victims and shit. See, it's like in their mind to be going to these blackmail events. It's like part of what they do. It's like a yearly ritual for them. And that they justify, well, it's to live. And it's like, they still are brainwashed into doing that Reagan fucking society shit. And that when Don Trump pedo band came waltzing into office, all of them got boom, real excited. They started trying, they have this whole like world where when Don Trump was in office, they thought that they could exploit the federal government at DOE side here. They thought that they could pull espionage and to be selling it on the side through Mormon overseas and shit. Huntsman,